Thank you for the warm welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other inputs over the next day and a half together. The inputs already have been so fascinating. And we're going to maybe shift directions a little bit over the next 20 minutes together to look at something that is a vitally important part of the integration of refugees and asylum seekers, but something that we often don't know really what to do with, and that's addressing the psychosocial needs that, of course, refugees and asylum seekers come with when they come to a new country. And of course, those issues can sometimes really inhibit their ability to integrate and to really lead very full and robust lives in their new places where they reside, whether that's a permanent residence or temporary. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today from a trauma-informed lens. Okay, so looking at what we know of trauma. How can we begin to apply that knowledge to our support of refugee and asylum seeker populations? But also, it's not in the title, we're also going to look a little bit at resilience. So how can we look at resiliency factors? How can we encourage resiliency factors amongst war refugees and other asylum-seeking populations? So, as you can see here, I've included some statistics that are really interesting based on current research around kind of levels of trauma and experiences of trauma that war refugees bring with them when they enter new spaces. So as you can see here, a recent piece of research has shown that up to 96.4% of refugees come having experienced at least one war-related traumatic event. Often more, but a vast majority having experienced at least one war-related event. We also know that asylum seekers are 5 times as likely as the normal population to have experienced mental health needs or disruptions, and 61% will have very, very high levels of mental health need. This is a very stark statistic, but up to 40% of adults experience PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, but up to 90% of children do. And I think this is an important statistic to examine because I think we tend to look at children and say, oh, they're resilient, they'll cope, they'll bounce back. But actually, kids are often coming with a very deep well of trauma or personal impact from their experiences of war. It's important to say when we look at particularly people that are staying in refugee camps or who are coming as refugees, that the duration, the severity, and the reoccurrence of traumatic events that they experience before coming into a new country can determine the kind of extent of their trauma responses, okay? So the more trauma they've seen and experienced, the more difficult it will be. And for people living in camps, the longer a period of time in camp, the more likely their experience of trauma or PTSD will be. I've included some indicators that are common, that we commonly see in people who have experienced war-related or conflict-related trauma. And I won't go through these lists, and certainly there are many, many, many more things that we could include as trauma indicators. But when you look at these physical, mental, and relational or behavioral impacts, you can see that for refugees and asylum seekers to integrate into a new country is a massive task. So if you're experiencing a lot of these kind of personal impacts, personal changes, it's very, very difficult to reintegrate successfully into a new society. So for example, if you are afraid to leave your residence, if you're having kind of disturbing thoughts or images or cyclical thoughts, it can be very, very difficult to focus on a job or a task at hand. If you're experiencing a sense of hypervigilance or that kind of hyperarousal in the body, that kind of awareness of danger all the time, again, it can be very hard to integrate into normal society. So I won't read through this list. You can look at it yourself. But I do want to sort of highlight this family strain. So we think about the experiences of refugees and asylum seekers, and they don't just remain with the adults. They don't just remain with one member of the family who maybe has experienced the most trauma. There's a cascade effect amongst family members. And so we often see this deeper impact on children. And so when we start to think about ways to support the psychosocial needs of refugees and asylum seekers, we need to think not only about individuals, but sometimes about the family unit as well. And I'll say more about that in a moment. It's important to note that resiliency is also a factor. So sometimes when we talk about looking at things through a trauma-informed lens, we forget about resilience, and that's an important factor to explore. Research has shown that trait resilience is actually really important for refugees overcoming their experiences of trauma. And when they're studying trait resilience, they mean actually traits within us, characteristics about ourselves that help us process or experience trauma. So one such trait is acceptance coping. So accepting what's happened to you, not trying to deny that it's happened, but saying, yes, this is a reality. How do I move forward from this? So they're showing that, research is showing that refugees and asylum seekers with strong trait resistance often can really show less signs of trauma impact or have a reduced likelihood of experiencing PTSD. Research also shows that the current environment for children is really important. And we've heard quite a few people mention accommodation, the importance of really safe residential accommodation, rapid and semi-permanent settlement whenever we can. So the environment that young children are in, their housing, their educational experience, but also the way their parents are coping can really impact how they might cope. So research studies that are more generalized as well show that parents and caregivers, if they're able to remain strong, if they're able to show signs of resilience, their children will cope better as well. So we need to think about ways to help really encourage this ability to cope within families and adults that are supporting young children. And finally, the last little bit of hopeful news before we move on, more generalized research also shows that kids who can be taught to remain calm, focused, calm in the face of challenge, who can be taught resilience tools, resilient skills, often that impact of trauma or adverse childhood experiences is mitigated for them. So when we look at that over a longitudinal period, kids who are taught resilient skills have less of an impact over time in terms of health and mental health. So, psychosocial needs. How do we begin to really look at the psychosocial needs of refugee and asylum seeker populations? I haven't included it on the slide because it goes without saying that clinical support is very important. Psychotherapy, counseling, therapeutic intervention on a clinical level is vitally important. But in the vast majority of all European countries, we see that waiting lists for mental health support, clinical mental health support, vastly exceed the amount of doctors and support that's often readily available. And we certainly find that Ukrainian refugees, for example, in the UK and Ireland are experiencing this. They're joining waiting lists that are already months long for the local population, and they're being kind of pooled in these same waiting lists without priority services. And so we're seeing that for a lot of people, they're really feeling that impact. They need mental health support and it's not available. So what can we do as a society? What can we do to really democratize mental health and the refugee and asylum seeker support from a psychosocial standpoint? One of the things I would suggest is helpful is psychoeducation and normalization. So some basic education for refugees and asylum seekers. What are normal stress responses? What are normal trauma responses? When you go through a very, very difficult or adverse or traumatic experience, what's really going to be normal for you to experience in your body or emotionally or relationally? I've worked with people from over 50 countries in the last 6 years, many of which are refugees and asylum seekers. And so many people will say to me, I thought I was crazy. Until I received this bit of psychoeducation about stress and trauma, I thought I was mentally weak. I thought I wasn't handling it well. And now I see I'm a normal human with very normal biological responses to trauma. So when we can educate people, when we can kind of help them understand better what they're experiencing, what their children are experiencing, that alone can really help give people that sense of peace and that ability to begin to heal. We can also provide somatic management of stress and trauma reactions. So some of you may be wondering about what is a somatic reaction. It's a body-mind experience. So those kind of experiences that we particularly see in the body in response to traumatic or stressful events. So helping people manage that if they're feeling hypervigilant all the time, if they're experiencing nightmares, if they're unable to eat because their digestive system is really being impacted by their stress responses, how can they manage that in the moment? So we're going to talk a little bit in a few moments about some case studies where we've taught people, how do you actually regulate your nervous system? How do you work with your body when you're feeling overwhelmed by stress reactions? And people being able to do that for themselves, to be able to support themselves and maybe their children, it really transforms their experience of stress and trauma and begins to allow them to lead much more active, integrated lives when they can manage those responses for themselves. It's also important to create a shared language within families and to create shared techniques or educate on shared techniques that families can use together. I know we've been talking a lot about language today. When we use the terminology language here, we're actually just talking about common understandings. So can children and can parents speak about stress or trauma responses within themselves in a way that's easy to understand and that everyone in the family unit understands. So we've learned that when we can begin to do this within families, there's a huge sense of empowerment there and greater connection. When children can look out for parents, parents can look out for children in very simple ways. We also want to empower refugee and asylum seeker families and individuals to really share stabilization techniques with others. So we're finding that natural leaders are wonderful teachers. So generally refugees and asylum seekers that make it to new places of origin have huge reserves of skill, education, life experience. They're natural leaders. And so when we can empower people to share some of these techniques with each other to help with psychosocial support and stabilization, it can make a huge difference, and it can spread some of those techniques much more readily. So I want to share with you very briefly some case studies of examples of how we've supported refugee and asylum seeker populations and support workers in a couple of key contexts. And I'll mention that the methodology that I've used mostly in this work is the community resiliency model, which has been designed for individual support and individual stabilization, but also designed very easily to be easily used in groups within families and to be passed and shared on very simply. So the model itself provides that psychoeducation to people who access it. It explains those very common responses of trauma and stress from a biological perspective, from a nervous system and brain and neuroscience perspective. And it really helps reframe this kind of human experience of trauma from one that often involves shame or pathology to actually one of hope and biology. We respond to difficult experiences, but we also heal from them. So how can we tap into that ability to heal and to develop our resilience? The model also provides 6 very simple biological well-being skills that help to really work with our nervous systems, bring ourselves back into balance when we're experiencing those stronger stress or trauma reactions. And what's really interesting is there's been extensive research done on this particular methodology from around the world, and the research shows very strong statistically significant decreases in depression, hostility, anxiety, and those physical or somatic symptoms of stress and trauma. So I, of course, want to start with a case study in Ukraine. There are many ways that we have shared this model in Ukraine over the last year and a half, but I'm going to just highlight 2 of them. So from the first week of the war, we provided online support spaces that were free and accessible to anyone. And we had 10,000 people join those calls the first week. And people were joining those calls from bomb shelters. People were joining the calls from trains, evacuating the country. People had their children with them. And we were teaching people the skills so that they could feel stronger and better in themselves in those critical moments. And then that they could use those skills and those tools over time to help, again, stabilize their nervous system when going through very difficult experiences of the war or of fleeing the country. When things became a little bit more regulated over the coming months, we then began to teach the well-being skills and tools to 246 support workers. So often these support workers were Ukrainian refugees themselves, either supporting internally displaced persons in different parts of Ukraine, or who had fled Ukraine to places like Hungary and Romania and were supporting incoming Ukrainians to settle and to integrate. And so we taught these skills to the practitioners. And what was really powerful about this experience is practitioners, support workers could use these skills to stabilize themselves in these processes, because as we all know, supporting people who've experienced trauma and war can really bring a lot of secondary trauma or personal impact for us. And so really helping people learn how to support themselves, as well as to have the tools and the knowledge to support others. So we were particularly asked by Ukrainian support workers and Ukrainians helping refugees outside of Ukraine about how to manage their own secondary trauma, how to prevent distressing thoughts and images, how to recover emotionally after hearing distressing stories, and how to support people in the middle of a trauma response. So if somebody was showing stronger responses, many support workers were saying, we don't know what to do. We've never been educated as to how to support people through this, so please let us know. So this is what we were focusing on. And I'll say one of the powerful stories that I keep with me from those experiences was of a Ukrainian refugee who was working in Romania, and she was having a very difficult time feeling hope after her experiences. And as we went through this process together, and as she learned some of these skills, she began to notice all of these things actually that were resilience factors for her. She was really enjoying helping support other Ukrainians. She was feeling very safe and accepted in Romania. Her mother was with her and safe. And those are factors that she began to be able to really focus on and use to draw on for a sense of strength. We've also been doing extensive work in Syria, and this has been taking place over a longer period of time, about 5 years. And this support work has primarily been provided either in Lebanon or in Turkey in the border regions, or online to Syrians in Syria. And we've, again, focused on IDPs as well as refugees who've left Syria over the last 12 years. The psychosocial impacts with this group were extensive because, of course, there's this 12-year duration of the war. There's ongoing hostilities and violence. There's a lot of external and internal displacement. And people are often struggling to acclimatize to new regions, so struggling to form lives in Turkey or Lebanon or other places. And then, of course, the earthquake of 2023 really exacerbated that for so many people, really kind of helped the trauma to either grow or to come back. And so what was really important for this particular piece of work was helping people have the tools to support other Syrians in these different contexts, but also to support themselves, particularly after the earthquake. And it was a real joy to watch people grow stronger during the lifetime of the project, and to begin to share stories of how it had helped them. And one particular instance that I like to share is of a family member who had survived the earthquake, and thankfully his whole family was safe and had survived. And then he was going on to provide earthquake response and support to others. But he had felt a lot of guilt and shame because when the earthquake started, he had grabbed the closest child to him and had run. And afterwards he'd said, "What kind of parent am I? I didn't stop to get my other children, I just ran." And being able to explain from a neuroscientific perspective, very simply, our brain science is such that fight, flight, or freeze initiates subconsciously and automatically. So your body was doing what it needed to do in that moment. It wasn't a cognitive choice. And he, the relief that he experienced right away, and he said, "This is so helpful. I'm going to be able to go and share this in communities because I know other parents are feeling the same way." So to be able to help people ease back from that shame or that guilt sometimes that people experience during these very critical moments, these crises, to be able to just understand a little bit more of the biology and what's happening in the body can be so important and so healing for people. Our final case study is Afghanistan. We taught well-being tools and skills to 18 women leaders who fled the country after the rise of the Taliban in August 2021. And these women were all politicians, judges, police women, lecturers, whose lives were under direct threat, and so had left the country very quickly and were scattered all over the world. So we did this piece of work over kind of the next months after people had settled, but in many, many parts of the world, so it was all online. And these women were very, very courageous, and we really engaged in this particular approach in a support group style, sort of a peer support group experience, and integrated the teaching and the learning into this. As you can see here, the participants mentioned a whole number of trauma indicators very clearly, such as nightmares, inability to sleep, intrusive thoughts or memories, weight gain or loss, hypervigilance, or reluctance to be alone. persistent crying, forgetfulness, feelings of physical heaviness or illness, etc. And what was really very hopeful during the project is we noticed that even in a short time, it was only 6 weeks long, participants reported a lot of relief in those symptoms of trauma or those trauma indicators, and described their experiences, helping them feel stronger, calmer, less alone, lighter, and ready for the future. And I'll finish with kind of a reminder that we need to support the supporters, okay? So when we look at those who are helping refugees and asylum seekers integrate, we need to remember that they experience a personal impact as well from their really important and much needed work. So recent research that I conducted with a number of colleagues around the world is that 96% of people who support war-affected populations say that their emotional well-being has been moderately to very impacted. And the symptoms that let them know that include fatigue, feeling emotionally drained, worry about safety, poor sleep, and impact on their family. But it's important also to say as we end that overall respondents would have shown that even though they might be personally impacted, they're professionally still resilient. So they're still able to do their work, but they carry that personal impact. And so I think it's a very clear call for us to be able to not only support refugee and asylum seeker populations with psychosocial support as they integrate into new contexts and new countries, but also to keep in mind those who support them, who help them with those integration efforts so that we can begin to look after their psychosocial well-being as well. So I'm gonna end there, but more than happy to take any questions or follow up via email if people would like to know more about the research.
Thank you, Sara. I am very, very glad to say that, well, thank you first of all again, and I'm very, very happy to say that there are 2 questions to you from the audience.
Okay.
So the first one is, what actions can governments take to address the long waiting lists for psychological and psychiatric assistance? Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent question. And again, so many European nations are really experiencing this right now, hugely long mental health waiting lists, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. I think investment is the only way forward. I don't think that we maybe take mental health investment seriously enough, certainly from the context of Northern Ireland. I haven't spoken much about Northern Ireland today, but a lot of my work has been influenced by displacement and conflict in Northern Ireland. And so there were 30+ years of civil war in Northern Ireland, and there was no real additional investment from the British government into kind of counseling or formal psychosocial support in Northern Ireland. And so I think we see this in many regions and many contexts. There's a lack of serious investment into kind of mental health support and more kind of clinical support that people need at higher levels. So I think it's just a call to governments to really say we need to take this more seriously than we do when we look at health budgets.
Thank you. And the second one, should psychological assistance for traumatized refugees be distinct from standard care?
Yes, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think what's very difficult is that mental and emotional and physical impacts are all very closely connected. So when people have experienced real adversity or trauma, often it shows up in the body. So we see that in a multitude of ways, including some of those trauma indicators that I shared. And sometimes it can be hard to know what's psychological and what's physical in the body. And so I think we need to have really significant health screening, particularly for refugee and asylum seeker populations, to really look at physical and mental health impacts and to be able to explore what those look like separately and together. I do hope, though, in what I shared, it was also clear that while that clinical support is absolutely necessary and that clinical screening should be a part of health screening for incoming refugees and asylum seekers, we can also do a lot as non-clinical professionals to support people's healing and growth. So everything that I shared in terms of the case studies was a non-clinical approach, all carried out by very well-educated and experienced practitioners, but who don't have clinical education in psychology or psychiatry. So it's important to recognize that there's a role for both. We need to be doing top-down and bottom-up support work to address mental health needs.
Thank you, Sara. Applause. Vital work and so many insightful ideas.